الله الرحمن الرحيم. الصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد والصلاة والسلام على صحبه وعلى آله أجمعين. So, assalamu alaikum to everyone. Before we start the session, then what's it called? Should we backtrack to the previous session if anybody had any questions or comments or points on that?
Maybe you could give a brief summary of the main points covered. We've got Brother Muhammad that's also joined us.
Cool. Okay, so from the last session, I think the most important point was the most important kind of set of points were that racism or racisms, more accurately, is not a. I will further develop this idea as we go into this presentation. Is not a single idea. It's a set of ideas. It's a set of things that are predicated on the idea that people are, or groups of people are inherently different. And that's not down to simply the skin color, but also things like temperament, intelligence, civilization, and their kind of propensity to be civilized or uncivilized, etc., etc. So all these different factors, and you had different ideas of how that might come about. So you had the spiritual, religious ideas of that, which were to say that the text of the Bible had kind of different. You could interpret the text of the Bible to read races into it. So you had these origins of the sons of Nuh alayhi salam, Noah alayhi salam, and Adam, and so on and so forth. Adam, whereby Adam was made in the image of God. And how did you reconcile that then with people who did not look white European, right? Because by the time that the Bible has been translated into any kind of vernacular English language, or even Latin, actually, at that rate, even translated into Latin, European language, Christianity had basically become a white European religion predominantly. So you had white European interpretations of it. So how do you reconcile this idea that Adam was supposed to be made in the image of God, and yet you had all these other different looking people? The only kind of reasonable explanation, according to these people to interpreting it, was that they weren't all the same, they were different. So that's the religious argument. Then you have the scientific, which sort of builds on it to some extent. So you had like people like Carl Linnaeus, who built on the religious argument and said, let's kind of ground it also in science. He develops this kind of taxonomy. Well, actually, he didn't develop it. I mean, it's kind of like there in what I guess you would call the zeitgeist. It's interesting for this presentation in particular because it originates in this kind of like beauty culture, this French beauty culture, where they're kind of rating the beauty and handsomeness of various races. So it kind of originates in that, and they split it out by saying these people are white, black, red, and yellow. And these people are more beautiful because of these features, and these people are less beautiful because of these features. You then develop that more by the time that Linnaeus is around and his kind of contemporaries, where they kind of become more scientific about it and try and really create these taxonomies and hierarchies. And then you have Blumenbach and these type of guys to kind of complicate it a little bit more. And by complicate it, I mean they add kind of more detail to flesh out a little bit. These are the main kind of things from the last presentation. But to do a quick thing, I know it's been a couple of weeks since we last met. So any points, any questions on that so far?
Just one quick question. I just tried to ask in the Western world, what were the almost hierarchies that were already established before some of this formalization into specific taxonomies and hierarchies.
So the question is, what were the hierarchies before it became formal?
So pre-existent within the Western world.
In the Western world. So you had, I mean, at that time, society was a lot more kind of feudal. So you did have these ideas of blood, right? So this idea of nobility and blood and blue bloods and this type of thing, it wasn't necessarily formal as a scientifically formal, quote unquote, but it was formal in the sense that society was built on these things, right? So you know, the idea was that if you were successful, if you were noble, if you were, you know, a monarch or related to a monarch, that was something inherently in you. Either it was your blood, or more likely, because it was linked with the church, it was that you were chosen by God. So you have this idea also, you know, these ideas that you have these ideas also that you know, God, you know, uplifts some people and he punishes others for whatever reason. So if you're a monarch, that means you're divinely chosen by God, and this was you know, this was very, very widespread for most of that kind of early modern period, and even, you know, predating that probably as well. So you do have this kind of, I don't want to say proto-racism, but it is differentiating on kind of like what's the word I'm looking for? Not inherent. The word I'm looking for is essentialized characteristics. So if you were poor, that was not because of any societal thing; it was because God made you that way, or you were a sinner, or whatever it was. That was what it was. And you became that. And that was the way these guys thought. If you were at a certain station in life, or if you had certain abilities, that was something that was essential to you as a person or people. So you had these classifications of society based on that. Noble, you know, monarch, noble, and then kind of like serf class for most of the early modern period, which then kind of develops into peasants and so on and so forth. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, exactly. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem.
I just had a question.
Yeah.
Can you guys hear me? Just wanted to make sure.
Yeah, I can hear you.
I just wanted to know, did they were they oppressing people of color consciously?
So yeah, I mean, it's interesting because a lot of this history is like, even up until you know, very recently, even up until like 1960s, 1970s, there's a question in kind of Western science or Western biology, which is, do black people, do people of color feel pain like we feel pain? And do they feel emotions? Are they that developed that they feel emotions to the extent that we feel emotions? So it's an interesting question. Was the oppression purposeful and kind of malevolent? Yes, absolutely. You know, there's no doubt about that. You know, I really don't want to make any excuses for anybody who was involved in any sort of racism, slavery, or anything like this. On the other hand, you know, perhaps it was a way of alleviating their own guilt, but there were people that were convinced that slaves, like, you know, despite everything that they displayed in terms of humanity, they were convinced that these people did not feel pain, did not feel humiliation, did not feel any emotions, or, you know, did not feel any kind of like, when they separated them from their families, you know, they didn't feel like white Europeans and white Americans, white people felt separation from their families. They didn't miss them, so you could separate them. There's really interesting cases of some slaves, right? So when you look at narratives of black slaves who led revolts, it's really interesting the way that they're framed. So I'm going on a slight tangent here, but it's interesting. I think you might find when you have people who led slave revolts, the narratives in the newspapers was, this guy, this person who led this revolt is almost like how we are as white people, right? In that he has displayed, or she has displayed, a desire for freedom. In that, she or he has displayed ingenuity and planning and this sort of stuff, right? It's really interesting because they really do not believe that any black person in particular, and people of color otherwise, can display those traits. So sorry, has my screen gone off? Can you guys still see the presentation? Yeah. Okay, that's weird.
Yep.
Yeah. So they they really don't believe that there are similar, white people and slaves have similar characteristics. But yeah, I mean, otherwise it was completely purposeful. It was absolutely kind of unhinged, if you like. Just give me a second. I think for some reason my screen's gone off, although you guys can still see it. I can't see it.
Yeah, we can see you.
Yeah?
Yeah, it's fine.
Let me just sort that out. Any other questions on that? Did I answer the question, by the way?
Yes, you did. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Any other questions from the previous session?
Yeah, just one. Just in relation to some wider reading. Later in the Republic, etc. There's a whole discussion around reproduction of obviously stronger features and stronger classes and specific peoples in order to strengthen the population that's been produced. I just wanted to ask in terms of, was that always anti-black in terms of relative to specific features, or was there something else that underpinned it as well? And the second one was really specifically about Bernard Spinoza and what type of contribution he played towards the elements
Spinoza.
of taxonomy and the Sage sect and things, etc.
Yeah. So the first question about breeding in particular, you're saying. So if I understood your question right, you're asking in terms of how certain features were highlighted, certain features were made desirable. Is that the question? And why?
Yeah. So
why?
it was literally an extract. It was literally an extract. I randomly picked up his literally a Cairo book fair just by chance about 10 years ago. And it was literally just a random extract. I remember reading specifically about, breeding, but specifically those with stronger features and specific features, and obviously ensuring that the stronger parts of the population reproduce as opposed to the weaker to benefit society as a whole. And I just wanted to ask were those features specifically, say, for example, anti-black, or was it just highlighted features and specific strengths relative to that civilization? So that was.
Yeah, so it's not always anti-black per se. It really depends on civilization and so on, right? So every civilization, I mean, you have kind of overlaps of characteristics and what characteristics become desirable, but things like courage and bravery and etc. Are kind of like you have the overlaps. How that is established is different within different contexts. But are they anti-black? So it's interesting actually, and we'll come through this in a little while as well. They're not necessarily anti-black in the sense that you have this caricature or this kind of like model of blackness, and you're like, well, we need to be everything that is not that. What tends to happen is there is some element of that, but what also tends to happen is you have this idea of this European. So the European is civilized, is intelligent, etc., and so on and so forth, and you want to be that. And anything that is not that European model is not necessarily black, but could be other races. When it comes to racism becoming more kind of sophisticated, then yes, it develops into anti-black, and you don't want black features. You don't want you don't want people to have black physical features or emotional or even spiritual features. What's interesting actually is how that becomes displayed, because the definition of black is in itself like not, it's not an easy thing to define, right? Because in Colin Kidd's book, in the introduction, it's really interesting. He's like, well, how, these people that were defining black, if you were to go on the type of something as arbitrary as earwax, right? Which is just, if you think about it, it's just as arbitrary as a skin color. Because if you go based on that, then there are people in certain parts of Africa that have more closer relationships with people in Europe than they do to other people in Africa, right? So the thing is, it's all about these centralizations. So yeah, anything that becomes non-European becomes black or becomes colored. Right, let me get the presentation back up. Does that answer the question, or not really?
No, it does. It does. Thank you.
Yeah. So, Tariq, can you make that second one a host, please? Because I can't share. Is that okay?
Yep, try now.
Cool, thank you. Right, so, right, is that back up now?
Yep.
Apologies for that. No, that's the wrong one. That's the previous version. Let's do that. Let's try that again. What's that in a bit more detail? I just want actually talking about kind of features and stuff. So okay, so yeah, so last week was about last week, but the last session was about creating a baseline for racism and figuring out how it kind of originated and the definitions in the early kind of like the beginnings of racism when it became a formalized kind of like way of thinking. Today's session is about exploring some racism and racialization. So how you deploy those definitions and how they become kind of like entrenched in cultures. And before we get into that, again, there's my contact details. If you guys want to have any more kind of like discussions, email. If you have my Facebook, feel free to message me on Facebook or whatever. Likewise, if you have my my phone number, etc. I'm happy to kind of have those discussions with you guys. They're useful. And if you guys want more readings, let me know. I'll try and put some stuff together for you if that's that would be of interest to you. So yeah, I'd say racism in action. So how do you connect those ideas to practice? How do you arrive at institutional racism, and kind of like what's the internal logic of racism? So racialization. So you guys probably have heard this term, and you guys probably know what it means already. But let's just give a quick definition of it anyhow. So racialization is the kind of act of creating these myths or these essentializations of a race, and then kind of like transposing them onto them, right? So examples of that are Orientalism, colorism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, which obviously is a big thing in the news currently. And how that is kind of transposed is you create these narratives of a certain group of people being criminals or even urban, right? This is the thing, right? So these racializations aren't always obviously kind of malevolent or obviously kind of like painting a group as being bad. They can be as benign or as benign sounding as urban, right? So this group of people is urban. That's I don't know if it's a big thing in Australia, but it's a big thing here in the UK. Definitely, you kind of define certain culture or certain people as urban. It's coded language for Black and people of color and this kind of thing, right? It's you don't want to go there. So that's a bit urban. and unprofessional as well. So why do certain people or certain groups of people, you know, why are they characterized as unprofessional? Or that's a type of racialization. So where those are particular kind of labels used or particular language used in racialization, Orientalism, colorism, anti-Semitism, and Islamophobia are more like systems of racialization or systems of race that have their kind of internal logic. In this session, I'm going to go through those top two. So I'm only going to go through Orientalism and colorism. And the reason being is I don't think we have enough time to cover everything. We have an Islamophobia session, the last week session. So do stay tuned for that as well. But Orientalism and colorism are interesting because they're kind of almost opposites in the way that they're constructed. Although they're both systems of racialization, and although they have kind of internal logics that are similar, you'll see that they're kind of like the way they're developed are opposite. And that's kind of very much the point, is that there's no single thing that you can say this is a racialization or this is racism or this is a this is a system, and it's like other systems. They tend to be a little bit different, even when it's the same kind of like philosophers, the same people that are enacting racialization. So I just realized why I didn't answer your question about Spinoza, did I? So Spinoza was quite influential actually in some of these taxonomies. So Linnaeus was like, he was one of his influences was Spinoza. He read his works widely, and although I don't think, if I remember correctly, Spinoza doesn't ever kind of like really formally go into racialization and taxonomies in a huge kind of in the way that Linnaeus and his kind of contemporaries do. He does do it enough to give these guys a start and to be like, okay, people, things have essential natures. That's where a lot of the racism came from. Actually, is like everything has an essential nature, and therefore human beings as different groups must also have essential natures. Okay, so constructive racist culture. I won't label this too much. So a lot of racialization is not just. So when we talk about institutional racism, it's not just that you are excluding someone. You are excluding someone or a group of people for a particular reason. And that very often has little to do with individuals or groups of individuals. It has to do with racism as a culture, right? So although we don't currently today think about groups in the way that Linnaeus and Blumenbach and these guys thought about it in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, we still kind of think along those lines. We still think that people behave differently based on phenotypes and genotypes, broadly speaking, and that can be, through culture, or that can be that can be through culture, or that can be through the way someone's raised, right? And we try and rationalize those differences that way. So we have racism in, and this is why it's so important. This discussion about representation or proper representation in media is so important, because when you have proper representation in media by people representing themselves, you get an accurate picture of who they are. But basically, what happens is you have this racism in art, in paintings and visual shorthand, etc. i.e., you will paint a group of people to be, represented as X, and other groups as Y, using these visual shorthand to represent darkness and light, good and bad, right? These type of narratives. This was a big thing in Orientalist works. And then you have racism in language. So you describe things so I'm sure you guys must have heard this term arabesque. This is a term that's used to describe things that have kind of like Islamic or Arab type, characteristics. It came into our lexicon through the French, actually. The French first used this word, funnily enough, where they described like certain geometrical patterns as being arabesque. Even to the point, actually, I think there's a ballet move that's called an arabesque. So this kind of language becomes very entrenched, and it made its way into the French through the Italian grotesque, which is similar in its meaning, or it's originally similar in its meaning. It's not so similar now, but you can see kind of like you can see how these kind of like labels and this kind of language begins to otherize and begins to kind of like paint or begins to kind of give a meaning to certain structures and certain ways of painting and doing things, and even to the point where you're standing like arabesque, right? And how that becomes associated with certain things. Again, obviously, Oriental is a term that's used to describe everyone in the East, and then obviously urban, which we just kind of discussed a little while ago, so I won't go into that too much. Any points on that? Any questions on that at the moment?
Yeah, I've got a question. So these representations of the East, does it affect people that are like people of color within the West only, or would you say it affects people of color globally?
No, it's something that affects people of color globally, right? So let me put up that map from last week. I like my maps. If you guys haven't figured that out yet, let's put up this map because this is interesting. So this is Ibrahim Mateli's map, right? So he splits the world, or actually the Europeans beforehand have split the world into these 4 parts. So you have the Oriental here, right? Indian Orientalis. So yes, it starts in the East. It starts as representations of culture and people in the East, but it does mean kind of like the way we are as people of color from the East in the West, right? So in kind of the early, well, I suppose in the 18th century, 19th century, these kind of times when things are getting smaller, i.e. travel is becoming easier and people are moving more freely, you have people coming from the East to the West, right? And in the Western imagination, they don't change their essential nature. They don't become less Eastern, or they don't lose their essential Easternness wholly, right? They can become more Western by their proximity to the West, but they will never ever lose their essential kind of Eastern characteristics. And then when you have people who are born here in the West, again, they don't, in the racist imagination, they don't lose those Eastern characteristics. They still retain those. And it's also a lot to do with the culture as well, right? So it's not just the racialization of civilization or your ability to be civilized, it's your culture also, right? So it's things like you are still Oriental because you adhere to Quran, for instance. You read the Quran and your religious sentiments are Islamic, therefore you are Oriental, right? Or Orientalist. You are Oriental. So you don't lose that necessarily by moving or being born in the West. Even to this day, I mean, I think we can see, even now in the whole things going on in France, that still is very much the case, that these people are blamed these guys that guy who did the beheading is like, it's because of your religion that you did this. Your religion is inherently violent, and these attacks on Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam are very much part of this Orientalist narrative, because obviously he's such a huge figure in Islam. You know, attacking that central figure is, I mean, they've been doing that since forever. You know, trying to mock Rasulullah and so on, and Islam. So yeah, you don't lose that Orientalism, or sorry, not Orientalness, just by having been born in the West. I mean, to really to do that, you would have to become like, you would have to completely shed all that culture, and like really kind of be public about it. You know, kind of like what's his name? Aziz Ansari, that comedian. You know, I think he's very much like very publicly not Muslim. You know, he's kind of declared that. So he's, you know, he would be an example of someone who has attempted to lose that Orientalness. Not wholly convincingly, but you know, enough, I think, that he's accepted into you know, the West zeitgeist, the West cultural kind of like machinery. Any other questions on that at the moment, or?
No, thank you very much.
Did I answer the question?
Yes.
Sorry,
yes,
I tend to ramble a little bit.
No, it's good. It's good. I like it. You're elaborative.
Good. All right, alhamdulillah.
Can you give a, maybe with all the recent events in France, can you give more of a picture of the dynamics, the social dynamics within France? Because it seems from Australia, it seems like a really toxic, very confrontational sort of environment in France, but maybe you know more about it than some of us.
Yeah. Well, yeah, hugely. It's huge. I mean, toxic is a good word, and confrontation is a good word. Hugely so. France has, France's relationship with Islam is just really like just bad, right? So France is like traditionally was a very deeply Catholic country. So they were kind of very antagonistic always towards Islam. I mean, going back into the Crusades, right? You know, you know, French Orientalism was at the forefront of Orientalism, right? So, and it was always, you know, scholars of Orientalism will say that French Orientalism was always way more antagonistic towards Islam than like British or American Orientalism. Not that they were any less not that they attacked Islam any less or the East any less. It's just that the French were kind of like a lot more vocal in their hate. So it's always been that case. You know, when you look back at this kind of like this tradition of like Voltaire and these type of guys who, you know, actually this question nicely comes into this slide now, who when they were kind of like looking at the works from the East, on the one hand, they were like, this is really amazing stuff. On the other hand, they were like, it's not as good as like we are as French people. We're really civilized and we have, you know, the slogan of liberty, equality, and fraternity, right? It comes out of like this high kind of like whole revolutionary and enlightenment period where they're shedding religious sentiments. So they're like, you know, we're enlightened because we don't necessarily have that religion anymore. But as I said, they're deeply Catholic, or they were deeply Catholic, and that hasn't gone anywhere. As much as they pretend that it has, that division of how they see the world is still very much that. It's that difference in Catholicism versus, or Christianity versus Islam, right? And that's like a cultural and religious boundary that hasn't gone anywhere. The French, I mean, to the point where this kind of stuff is so deeply entrenched in them. In Algeria, I mean, you guys probably heard stuff, the atrocities that happened in Algeria. They not only carried out those atrocities against the Muslims, it was very much, French Orientalism was very much about destroying the symbols of Islam, which is why they still attack to this day, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? So in Algeria, what they used to do was they mobilized a lot of these kind of like liberal classes, right? And it's always interesting, by the way, in colonialism, how the liberal and the conservative pivot off each other. So in the metropole, at home in Paris, things were very conservative. Things were very conservative. So women were encouraged to cover up, and etc., etc. Right? That's why you get this dichotomy of the nuns wearing their I don't know the term for that. I think it's the habit. It's a term for their the headdress they wear. It's why you can have that dichotomy where the nuns wear that, and the Muslim women are like, no, you can't wear hijab. Right. So in Algeria, what they used to do, they had this campaign, these liberals, and they would normally be the wives of officers serving in the army or the police, etc. So they led this kind of like hijab liberation movement to the point where they actually found this woman, and they basically put her in one of these big squares in Algiers. And she publicly removed her hijab. And they were like, this is an amazing win for Muslim women in Algeria, right? This is now a public thing. It just so transpires that what happened was that this particular Muslim woman had a brother who the French authorities had arrested. And they had basically said to her, you can either remove your hijab or we execute your brother. And that was the choice they gave her. So it was obviously less a win. But that's the relationship France has with Islam and with the symbols of Islam, right? Which is why, again, you still have this kind of thing in France where you cannot wear the hijab, you you have to be okay with us being able to insult Rasulullah and and so on and so forth, right? That's the relationship France always had with Islam. And it comes from this. It comes from this idea of translating the East, right? So as we were just saying previously, building these systems of racism requires certain cultures and certain like understanding of those cultures, or to kind of like say map out and define and give borders to a culture. So the way that they did that, the French were kind of at the forefront of this, was that they built schools and they built universities to translate texts that were originally in Arabic, Sanskrit, and Tamil. I mean, any student of Arabic here will tell you one of the best Arabic dictionaries is Hans Wehr Dictionary, which is a German dictionary, right? If you guys study Arabic, you will know that. But this is what they did. They defined these things by through translation. So they took, what they would do is they would go and travel to India, the Middle East, Sri Lanka, and so on and so forth. They would literally bring back these huge volumes of text, and they would often be things like the Quran, the Vedas, religious and spiritual texts, and even kind of like folklore. They would kind of like they would collect those and bring those back, and they would translate them into either Latin or a vernacular European language like French or English, something like that. These translations claim to be objective. Translations are never objective, right? Translations are never objective. Anybody, again, who kind of studies Quranic Arabic and Arabic translations of the Quran will tell you this. Like, the differences between translations in Quran are like, are huge. They're never objective. They have an ideological bent. They have an ideological way of doing that. And what happens is what Edward Said called this inside-outside paradox, or inside-outside paradox, where basically you as an observer, you're translating something, right? To give you an Urdu idiom, or let's use an English idiom actually. I don't know if you guys have this in Australia, but we say in the UK all the time, we say it's raining cats and dogs. Now that, if we were to translate that literally, is just like or ideologically, it will be a very difficult thing to do. What you mean is that it's raining really heavily, but they're translating that into Urdu or to another language. Like how would you go and how would you describe that? And if you have an ideological predisposition of, these guys worship cats and dogs, like, how do you translate that sentiment into that, right? So in translating the Quran, translating the Vedas and so on and so forth, the French, the English and so on, they not only translated the words, they translated their own sentiments into those texts, right? So these ideas of like, so I'll put the name at the bottom, Roberto de Nobili. So he was a Christian missionary from Italy, and is widely considered to be one of the first Orientalists, if not the first Orientalist. And what he did was he traveled to India and he started translating the Bible using these kind of idioms that were in Sanskrit, that existed in Sanskrit. So he would use Sanskrit terms for things like God, or things like text, or things like priest. So he had to find an equivalent thing, right, within the Sanskrit culture that matched ideologically, or matched kind of in his sentiment or perception of what the East was and what the West was. And what ends up happening, Roberto de Nobili basically ends up kind of valorizing the Brahmin class, because he's like, well, these guys are priests and teachers. So if you guys don't know how the castes work in India, what you have is you have the Brahmins at the top. The Brahmins are teachers and priests. Then you have the castes underneath those, which are like the administrators. Then you have your kind of like warriors and stuff like this, and then you have the Dalits who are kind of the untouchables. So he was like, because they're teachers, because they're priests and people of God, they must be a higher caste. Now I'm not going to kind of put that all onto Roberto de Nobili and say that he created the caste system in India, but he certainly contributed heavily into its valorization. So he's an external viewer, viewing Indian culture and viewing Indian text, and he's translating these things into what he might consider to be objective, but it's not. And then you have this idea of virtualization. So, i.e., not virtual, I think creating something virtual, but the idea of translating virtue into the kind of original text. So again, the example of Roberto de Nobili, where he's because in European culture, priests at that time were high class, well-to-do, etc., etc. He has translated that virtue also into the priestly class of India, right? And by doing that, you start to create these hierarchies. You start to create these kind of like perceptions of the East. It then becomes problematic, as Said explains. It becomes problematic when the translator, when the translation is translated back, right? And this is, it becomes an interesting problem because it's an observation of an observer that you're translating, right? So you're learning about yourself through someone who has nothing to do with you, really and truly. Kind of modern examples of this might be Islam is a religion of peace, right? As a translation of a Western translation of Islam. And we translate that back and we transpose that back and we kind of self-orientalize. So Orientalism began as a project of translation, translating these texts, translating important texts to cultures, and inserting judgments or virtue or anything like that into those texts. And the French were kind of at the head of this. The French really, like, they took volumes and volumes and volumes, mainly from Sanskrit and Tamil, So it was kind of a lot of Hindu text, but they also did translate some Arabic stuff as well, which actually is one of the first translations of the Quran into a vernacular European language was this copy here, the Al-Quran de Muhammad by Andrew de Raya. So this was 1647. So he translated it into French. There was a previous version. Actually, there was two previous versions of this. This very first version, I think the guy was French as well. Paul. I can't remember his surname now. I can't remember. But I think he was a French abbot. He translated it into Latin. And then you had a Spanish version, which I couldn't find a source for. But this one is this copy here is widely credited as being one of the first into an available, i.e. accessible vernacular language in 1647 into French. Now that's an important step because you're not now confining these translations to people who are well read in Latin and who are kind of academics and priests and this sort of thing. You're making this available to people in the public, the general public, to come pick up and read, right? So it's become very the project of Orientalism has been kind of moved from the confines of what might be the priests and bishops and so on, i.e. kind of like these people who are invested in tackling Islam theologically and so on, to a public arena. It's now a public thing. You can do this. You can be involved. The French public can be involved in, and anybody who speaks French can be involved in the Orientalist project. Which is why actually I prefer to think of Orientalism as starting around this period. Well, actually probably about 100 years prior, so the mid to late 16th century, rather than some people who kind of argue it started in the 12th century. Just because it's at that point in the 12th century, it's confined to these kind of academic circles and priestly, clerical circles, rather than with the public. You can't construct these institutions solely in the academy. It has to be a public. It has to be a public space where they're constructed. As I said, that this translation actually became obsolete by the next century. What's interesting about this translation actually is that there is later editions. So I think from the second edition, they included information about the Ottomans. So they were like, here's the Quran, and here's the people that believe in it, the Ottomans, and here is a list of the characteristics. So it describes them like the taxonomies that we kind of discussed earlier on, but it fleshes out a little bit more. So it's not just like, it's not just like these people are ruled by law like we had in the previous type thing, right? It's more like, this is their culture, this is who they are, they enjoy this sort of thing and that sort of thing, and we'll see that in a second, how they kind of constructed that. But these were important steps, translating these texts to understand who people were. And the intentions of this weren't like innocent. They were to be like, let's now create a project to defend ourselves and attack Islam and attack the Quran and attack the personage of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Any questions on that? Any comments? Okay, so that's the translation project, and then Orientalism moves on to writing about the East. So you have brought over all these texts about the East, the Vedas, the Quran, and many other texts, right? So things like folk tales. You collect folk tales, which may or may not actually be that popular, but you collect them nevertheless. And then you start to write about the East. So you've translated, now you're writing about the East. So these works, as it says there, work of writing is often self-referential of the genre as a whole. So, i.e., you start to you start to refer to yourselves as experts, and you rely on other so-called experts of the East who are relying on other experts who are relying on translations, right? So these aren't like first-hand observations. These are now like just building on works that have come before. And it becomes this genre of Orientalism, and it becomes this speciality of Orientalism, right? And Orientalists now, in coming out of the 16th into the 17th centuries, an Orientalist is someone who like has a career, who is a specialist at a certain region of the East, right? He's that person. He or she is an Orientalist. That is actually like it's mind-boggling how that is like a thing, right? Because it's like how can you be an expert on something that you've never experienced? How can you be an expert on something that is not really yours to begin with? Nevertheless, they start to refer to themselves as experts on these things, right? And you have institutions like SOAS in the UK set up specifically to teach Orientalist and African studies. You have institutions set up in the East, like Fort William, which are doing things like teaching languages of India, and then given the opportunity to kind of write about these sort of things. And like it's just it becomes a very incestuous genre, borrowing from one another and so on and so forth. And you end up doing writing of the East from the West. So, this again, this idea that you're so detached from your subject, by thousands of miles, and you're writing on them, having never ever experienced this. And yeah, so both fiction and non-fiction. So fiction, obviously, non-fiction obviously is important because things like religious text, manuals for behavioral conduct, etc., etc. Like you can see why they might be important to include. Fiction is also important because it speaks to the myths of a society, the kind of inhibitions and what's that I'm looking for? Inhibitions and the aspirations of society. Fictions are really important in doing that. So you start translating fiction and non-fiction, and they build, or they attempt to build, a complete picture of the East through that. So so you have this thing here, right? Tales from 1001 Nights, which has anyone read that? I'll admit it was one of my favorite books growing up, actually. And Tales from 1001 Nights, or what's it? It's in Arabic. It's Alf Layla wa Layla, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong, Wahaj. I think that's right. In Arabic, you don't do a plural for the for 1,000, do you? Is that right? I think that's right.
I think it's Alf Layla wa Layla. Yeah, I think so.
That's it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah. So that's it's a really interesting book, right? Because it's if you guys have read it, you'll know what I'm talking about. It's this really kind of painting this picture of Muslims in particular, Muslim East in particular, and how it's all very kind of like magical and filled with genies, and it's very sensual, and people are just like just everyone's just horny all the time and this sort of thing, right? And it's basically a bunch of folklore. So 1001 Nights is basically a bunch of folklore. There's nothing really in any Arabic text that I could find, at least anyway. And I don't think anybody else has ever found anything in kind of like this ancient, or not ancient, or medieval, modern Arab world that is is called 1001 Nights. There's nothing that exists like that. It's a bunch of folklore. It's a bunch of folk tales. Some of them may be oral, passed down, and it's all different cultures. So these tales of 1001 Nights are not from a single culture. So they may be from, you may have one story that's from Egypt, another that's from Persia, another that's from somewhere else, right? And they're all mixed up together to create this kind of like thing about these are Arabs. I mean, actually, I think even explicitly in the Aladdin story, it says that it's part of it is situated in Samarkand, which is nowhere near Middle East. But there you have it. You know, Muslimness is equivalent to Arabness or Arabesque, as we said earlier on. So it's an interesting story, and you still have this today. You have stories from 1001 Nights today. I mean, they just recently remade Aladdin with all these tropes intact. One of the first kind of books that you kind of have writing the East in fiction is this book here, Les Orientales by Victor Hugo, which is basically a bunch of poems about the Orientals, right? And talking about the Orientals, and you can see from the cover there, it's like, you know, this perception of the East that it's just full of harems, and you know, it's a very kind of Western male fantasy, right? Which is that this land or these lands are there for us to go and conquer, and for us to go and take advantage of, and liberate. And you know, these all these fantasies and all these myths come together when you're writing Eastern fiction, and you know, it's absolutely just like ridiculous. These kind of fantasies and how they play out, and then you have these kind of things, Oriental stories, which was published in 1930. I think it ran for 4 years. This magazine was published in 1930 and ran until 1934. I think it was monthly or quarterly, something like that. But that included kind of similar stories, you know. And this one is by this guy W.B. H. Hurst. You know, so these aren't Eastern writers. These aren't writers from the East. These are people in the West now. So you've gone through this process of translating works. You've gone through this process of creating what you believe to be non-fiction, i.e. fact, which may be anthropology, or maybe kind of like societal descriptions or whatever have you. And now you're actually writing fiction. You're writing absolute you know, fictions based on your fantasies of the East, in these kind of like texts and their depictions. So what's the time? Okay, so we've got a bit of time left. Can I stop there quickly for 5 minutes? I always like to stop for 5 minutes if that's okay with you guys.
Yeah, sure.
Is that all right? And then we'll come on to here the next hour.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so to my water up. All right. See you guys back here in 5 minutes.
Nice.
The idea that what you have to understand is less so now, but within the you know, when kind of like stuff about Orientalism was really big, really up until Said writes his book in '78. You know, this kind of like idea that not necessarily that it was all magical and like, you know, I don't think many people literally believed this. It was more so that they believed Muslims literally believe in this sort of stuff. Now, obviously, we have the ghaib and so on and so forth, but the idea that, you know, you can find a lamp, you know, and clean and rub the lamp and you get a genie that grants you 3 wishes and blah blah, and like, you know, all this kind of nonsense. Yeah. And everything else that's in 1001 Nights, right, is, you know, if you believe that someone literally believes this, that's their culture, and you're being voyeuristic about it, and you're deriving this kind of voyeuristic pleasure from the idea that these guys are so dumb they believe in magic, or these guys are so dumb, you know, they believe in, like, they haven't developed science, right? Yeah. Because they believe in magic and everything's magical.
Yeah.
On the other side, it's this idea that, I mean, Aladdin. So everything within the 1001 Nights, as I said, is kind of mostly folk tales and mostly kind of like different versions exist in different cultures, right? It's like these stories of Layla or Majnun. You have a lot of different stories of Layla Majnun from Bangladesh to probably even as far as Egypt, I would say. I'm sure there's some versions of this story that exist, perhaps with different names. Now, that's my train of thought now. My point was that when you try and say that these are beyond folktales, these are things that people really believe, or you essentialize certain characteristics. That's the thing, right? So when you take 1001 Nights and you say that there are essential characteristics that run through all of these as a theme: magic, sensuousness. I mean, how often in 1001 Nights does it occur that a dashing prince meets a beautiful princess, and on the first night they're getting jiggy, right? To want a better phrase. It's remarkably common. So this idea of transposing these folk tales that, for the most part, probably, I mean, it's difficult to say how prevalent these were in society. There probably was some version of it in societies, but I mean, how prevalent really were they? And then to transpose ideas of how people live based on these fictions, that's the problem, right? So again, it comes down to these fantasies that white colonialists and Europeans had of the sensuous Asian woman, right? So that picture I showed you of Tullius's here. So this picture here, right? So you have these depictions of the Asian woman here, or the Oriental, sorry, who is sensual and having incense and all this kind of stuff, right? That's the problem. It's these depictions, and then you have these fantasies of going to conquer them and effectively raping these people, and you have and this plays out. So like Pocahontas, for example, from a different part of the world, Pocahontas is another tale that almost exactly happens. So Pocahontas was a real woman, a girl actually. She was, I think, very young teens, probably like 13, 14, when John Smith met her, and he basically captured her and raped her and all this kind of stuff, and kidnapped her effectively. And then he wrote these fictions about what we see in the Disney movies today. So he wrote those fictions saying, I met this woman and it was amazing. We had this romance and she saved my life and blah blah. Like, that never happened. Pocahontas the real Pocahontas was a very revolutionary person, and a very young girl at that, right? So these kind of fictions, that's the problem. It's not necessarily that they have to be negative. It's enough that they are kind of like inaccurate and that you transpose your fantasies on them, right? So these fictions have created these fantasies of these kind of mystical lands that are, everyone's, always kind of like, available sexually and all this kind of stuff. Did I answer the question?
Yep, cool, thanks.
Yeah, so it's what I'm trying to impress on you guys from that first bit is that the text and how central and important those texts were in creating these depictions of the Oriental, and their translations and their movement from being completely academic and within the academy to being publicly available, right? So their consumption of Oriental literature, as we saw in that last picture here, that's pulp fiction. This is basically, these Oriental stories are pulp fiction, right? So this is like mass produced kind of white by numbers type stories that is available for the mass public, right? It's available in all places where books are sold, kind of thing, right? Victor Hugo may be like slightly, what you might say, slightly more highbrow, but still massively available. And the same thing, 1001 Nights. I mean, it's hugely available to everyone, and that's the thing. You have a public now that is kind of feeding off these stereotypes and depictions. The text is one thing, and then you have academic art, which is a movement which originates in France, or has a very strong grounding in France, right? Academic art, romantic art, and what it's supposed to be is similar to its textual counterpart, is this objective depiction of Oriental life and Oriental people, right? So it's not like art for the sake of art. It's like this is factual and accurate and blah blah. So you had this movement that started in the 19th century, so coming into like probably like the latter half, maybe the 19th century, maybe a bit earlier than that, where painters started painting these scenes, and you had a mix of the same with the text. You had a mix of two. You had some painters that actually went and painted, so they would go and travel to particular regions in the East that may be of interest to them, or they may go through what they consider to be the East as a whole, and come back to their Paris studio and draw a depiction of what they saw. Others just completely painted imagined scenes, like what they thought the East was like, based on text and based on paintings. Now you can probably see the parallels here between here and what Charlie Hebdo has done. Although I wouldn't necessarily call it Oriental art, it's not necessarily doesn't really bear the same kind of like hallmarks in style and etc. But you can see how they're using painting to portray a particular image of the East and of Muslims. And so it basically starts in mainly France, or it really was popular there. You have a split between the French and the British, and in terms of art that they do. But it's similar to the text in that it focuses on particular things. So you have this, for instance, I'll give some examples of some paintings. So this is Les Fantis de Tangier by Delacroix. Delacroix was he was one of the earliest Oriental painters, and really kind of like he painted a lot of this sort of stuff, and you can see that that's a scene. So he's focusing on a scene of these people in Tangiers, and what seems to be some sort of like rowdy thing going on, and how is that supposed to be? I mean, what are we supposed to be looking at? A riot, a marketplace? It's not really clear there. But these are the sort of things that would be presented to people to consume. They had a lot of this sort of stuff. Harems, pictures of harems, pictures of women. And again, you can kind of see the similarities between how they're dressed and how Ortelius's map depicts them. Kind of similar, like wearing silks and dressed in fine jewelry and hairbrush and blah blah and so on and so forth, and people of leisure basically. And this obviously becomes a problem where, as far as depictions of the East are concerned, because what would generally happen in the East is, or rather Muslim countries, is that you would have different sections of the house for different, for the women and for the men. Not always the case, but it was a fairly prevalent. In South Asia, in the Mughal kind of like societies, they called it Zinana, right? So the Zinana was the kind of like construct of separating the genders and having an inner sanctum where the women would basically kind of have their space. So when you depict that as being a harem, obviously that's problematic, because there are certain ideas that are linked to that. That these women existed solely for the sexual gratification or sexual pleasure of men, of a single man, perhaps even, right? In some cases, was problematic. Not to say that this didn't go on. It did go on to some extent. In particular, kind of like in the royal palaces, and that's probably as far as it went. I've never come across anything to suggest that anyone other than Mughal princes or Turkish princes, for instance, in a society had this going on, like the noble people that, it's either incredibly rare or doesn't exist really, and definitely not at the level of anyone low down in society. But yeah, you can see how this might construct gender roles within of a society, of an Oriental society, when you depict things as being harem-esque or within harems. What's interesting as well, actually, is that it doesn't clearly speak to the political power that women in the harems had, and that was often, depending on the period, depending on the prince, and depending on the king, was quite often quite a lot. So I can speak to the Mughals. The Mughal harem, the women in there were kind of very involved politically, were often the political forces behind certain actions, large scale, like certain wars, whatever. Wars of succession would be a big thing in the Mughal harem, because the Mughals didn't believe in this concept of the firstborn should inherit the throne. So it was like one of the sons of the Mughal king is going to get it, and generally what would happen is that would play out within the harem, that kind of politics. So it has politics of favoritism, the favorite wife, the favorite concubine, etc., etc. They would try to position themselves, and then there would be, a lot of them were shrewd tacticians as well. And then obviously you had some Mughals who built, like Taj Mahal was a monument to Shah Jahan's wife, Mumtaz. So yeah, this kind of idea of the harem and women are only exist in Eastern society, the sexual gratification of men kind of comes from this idea of the harem. Like painting like this, focusing on Bashi Bazouk. So this is the type of soldier. What's interesting about these pictures is, if you look at this, it's kind of like voyeuristic. Again, you're supposed to be an impartial an impartial viewer of these going-ons, right? And then you have this kind of like this guy, the Bashi Bazouk, again, who is like, how are we viewing him as an observer? Is he there kind of modeling for us, or how do we interact with this picture? Kind of like less so like this is a scene. This is a zoomed in version of an individual, and why focus on this individual in particular? The Bashi Bazouk were type of soldiers who basically, I don't think they were paid. They basically went with the army. They were mercenaries, and they took spoils from like ghanima, if you like, spoils from the war or the fight, whatever it was. So it's an odd choice of subject, if you like. So philia, racism and philia. So this kind of, I think, speaks to your question about it. about negativity. So the opposite of phobia. So racism operates on this axis of phobia and philia. So we often tend to associate racism with phobia, right? They're scared or they otherwise, and we place racism on that sort of scale. But philia is just as important, it's just as bad as that phobia and that kind of like otherization. Not otherization, because philia also otherizes, but you understand what I mean. So philia is the kind of enamorment of a culture. And often it means adopting or emphasizing parts of a racialized culture. So appropriation, highlighting certain parts and being like, the East is so wise, right? So again, this idea of writing virtue into a culture. The East is so wise, they're like all these wise sayings, or they have all this wisdom, or they have all this kind of like asceticism. It's a different way of living, right? You can see that in Lord Byron there, who is, what's he dressed as exactly? He's adopting, is that supposed to be some sort of like depiction of his idea of the East, or something? It's interesting. And Lord Byron, if you guys, I'm sure you guys know who he is, but for those who might not, was a poet and was a very how to describe it? He was very sexually active. Let's put it that way. He was very kind of loose in that kind of sense, and he based that on his idea of the East. He wanted to be like that. He's so enamored, and so you can see how that kind of harem culture, that kind of like sensual culture, has translated into Lord Byron, kind of being the way that he is. Because he became so enamored by his idea of it. And you can see this actually in the hippies and that kind of whole movement. So the Beatles, they had that yogi, I can't remember his name now. They had this yogi who turned out to be a complete fraud. Yoga is a big thing. I can't speak to the benefits that it has in terms of health and et cetera, but yoga is like, it started in the 1960s, believe it or not. It's not at all. There's no evidence for it being ancient. There's no evidence like whatsoever it being like this kind of like practice that was passed down from generations for thousands of years. Like there's no evidence of that whatsoever. It started with this kind of whole movement, this whole hippie movement in the 60s, peace and love, blah, blah, and like, try to adopt Eastern characteristics. What's really interesting again is that these positive depictions of, and this is why it's so bad, philia is so bad, these positive depictions lead to more readily self-racializing and self-orientalizing. So in the 60s, what happens, I think, and also in the 70s to some extent, what happens is there's this thing called the hippie trail, which basically goes through Afghanistan, Pakistan, and into India. And these hippies turn up in Afghanistan dressed in what they believe to be Eastern type clothing and Eastern type mannerisms and blah, blah, blah. And these guys in Afghanistan, Pakistan, North Pakistan, and India are like, what the hell are you guys doing? Like, this is not how we dress, or this is not how we behave. Eventually, though, what happens is that because these hippies are bringing in this positive image and bringing in a lot of money, these the people there begin to adopt those characteristics, right? Because it's positive. So what happens is very quickly the waters get muddied, and you can't figure out where the hippie mythology starts and ends, and where quote unquote authentic Afghani, Pakistani, Indian culture starts and ends. You can't differentiate between the two very easily. So this is why philia is so bad. It can lead to more readily self-racialization, right? And again, it's like you can see this in things that are as benign as saying Islam is the religion of peace. right? That sort of thing, that adoption of that. Where did that come from? And it's not even true in the slightest. I mean, in respect to how we operate as a religion, how we operate as a culture, and so on and so forth. Like the idea that something is of peace. Like, what does that mean? Like, how do you display that? Like, if you're attacked, and so on and so forth. Right? You understand what I'm trying to say? But these type of
Can you elaborate on that point?
Sorry,
can you elaborate on that point?
But the Islam is a religion of peace.
Yes.
I mean, obviously, like, you have this idea that to say that you are a peaceful people, what does that mean? Very often, peace is a synonym here for being kind of like turn the other cheek, right? So if you are attacked, you don't defend yourself. If you are if someone is violent towards you, and we can see this actually in this Charlie Hebdo thing. If someone is violent towards you, you bear it, and you don't defend yourself. You don't come out and be, vociferous in your defense in any way whatsoever. You just kind of bear it and take it. And this sort of idealization that is what is peaceful. You meditate and you do your namaz and your prayers or whatever, and that's all it is. It's ludicrous to think that any way of life would teach you to not defend yourself or not to or to be kind of what's the word I'm looking for? To be kind of again, like that whole kind of style of turn the other cheek in the face of violence, right? So often that gets deployed in situations like the Charlie Hebdo thing, where we have an outright vicious attack on us, and instead of being, you have had a lot of Muslim commentators who, instead of saying actually Muslims are right to be outraged and Muslims are right to be demand that this sort of thing no longer occur, you have this something of like, well, let them do what they want to do. They, we are, we should have patience, right? This idea of patience. And again, how that translates at the macro and the micro. So at the macro, it's like, yeah, let them attack you and blah, blah, and be happy or whatever, have sabr and tawakkul or whatever have you, right? Obviously, those concepts exist in Islam, but they get deployed often in a way that they're not intended to be deployed. And then you have that at the micro level, whereby you have internalized this idea so much that you are peaceful people, and that you are wise, and this idea of Roberto De Nabili that the highest class of people are these scholars, and that's what we should aim to be: non-violent, non-defensive, etc., just like objective bystanders of that have this higher morality, let's say, and that gets translated to the micro, whereby you have people who are in toxic, violent relationships, and you tell them to aspire to this higher morality, which you believe your religion teaches you. And in the face of, for example, domestic violence, you're asking someone to have sabr, right? Which really is, a play on this idea that we are a peaceful people. Have sabr. It's a higher morality. Peace is a higher morality. And it's never, and the micro and the macro is never, at any level, it's never as neat as that, right? Peace as a higher morality is never as neat as that. Again, we're talking about defense. We're talking about being quote unquote violent in the defense of yourself or in the defense of someone else, or to alleviate oppression. I mean, these are very kind of like they're big topics in themselves, but I hope I'm clear in that the idea that peace is a higher morality than defense, or peace is a higher morality than violence, or peace is a higher morality in as opposed to what exactly is an Oriental philia trope that we have, I think, internalized. Is that kind of answer the question or not really?
Yeah, no, it does. That was a very clear. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Yeah, it's things like that. It's things that, like, when we talk about virtue and reading virtue into text, right? That's what we're talking about. Where did this idea that Islam is peaceful? Islam is a particular type of morality come from? It's very often racialized tropes that we have adopted, or racialized tropes that we have adopted from an external observer. Okay, so that's Lord Byron, and very conscious that we're running out of time. We haven't touched colorism yet. Oh, you guys might have seen, I thought I'd include this. You guys might have seen Diana Dark's book, which was published maybe a few months ago, on, it's called What We Stole from the Saracens, I think, or something like that. Something along those lines. And basically it's a book about architecture, Muslim architecture that gets stolen by Europeans. It's a really interesting book. If you guys haven't read it, definitely recommend it. She talks about how the Crusaders went to the Holy Lands and came back with, their eyes open to the architecture possibilities of how they could develop their churches, etc., etc. And this is an example of that. So Brighton Pavilion in the UK, in Brighton, modeled after, you can see the onion type domes there, the minarets, this kind of like columns that we might see in Mughal architecture and other places also. Kind of arabesque, quote unquote, arabesque geometrical designs there. So you're taking these kind of things. There were Dark Steeding from the Saracens. And what happens with this kind of philia is, appropriation is a type of philia. And so this is Notre Dame from before it was burnt down. And this was, according to Diana Dark, was taken from a church in, I think it was Syria somewhere, maybe just outside Damascus. Obviously uncredited. And Notre Dame has become this huge, or was this huge tourist attraction, where people flocked from all over the world to see this amazing architectural marvel of this church. And that whole kind of Gothic style, was stolen from the Saracens, who, on the other hand, are said to be uncivilized and unable to develop civilization, and yet you're stealing artifacts from them. Okay, so we're going to colorism now. So I'll stop there for any other questions or points about Orientalism.
Yeah, Nadeem, could you clarify philia? Because I couldn't quite understand what the concept of philia really is. Is it a fetishization, or is it like, what is it exactly?
Yeah, it encompasses kind of like all of what you might associate to be enamorment or love. Not love, I think love is more kind of a positive thing, but yeah, fetishization, that sort of thing, where you kind of like Lord Byron here and other Orientalists fetishized the Oriental women in particular, in the case of Lord Byron and other people similar to him, and yeah, all that kind of stuff. Like, you're really it's supposed to be this positive thing, and it really isn't, because on the one hand you're fetishizing and you're kind of like being enamored by it. On the other hand, you cannot operate that philia without the otherization and phobia, right? So they both go hand in hand. It's it's like the saying, one hand washes the other. You cannot have philia without the phobia and otherization.
Can you give an example of that?
Of fetishization, or something else?
Like you said, you cannot have the philia without the phobia.
So the philia can only exist where you have otherized someone. You can't have so for instance, like in the modern day, we may fetishize big lips, for instance, right? So this is a big thing now in kind of like Western beauty standards. However, that can only exist. That idea, that desire, can only really exist when you have already otherized people to an extent. So you've said that these characteristics of big lips, etc., are a characteristic of black women in particular, and that has gone on for a number of years. And then someone has decided that that is aesthetically pleasing, and then that becomes a fetishization. Is it true that big lips are exclusively a feature of black women? I don't think so. I think, you know, like Colin Kidd, again, you know, if you're going to read one thing on this, well, maybe not this, maybe on the previous topic, Colin Kidd's introduction is really good. You know, like he really kind of like nails the absurdity of race. To me, like, you know, Africa as a continent has more genetic diversity than the entire rest of the world put together. You know, you have the shortest people in the world living there. You also have the tallest people in the world living there, averaged out in terms of a single community, and so on and so forth. So when you otherize and you say these are essential characteristics, you can do one or two things with them. You can say that's an essential characteristic we like, or that's an essential characteristic we don't like. And the same is true of Orientalism, in that they essentialize these characteristics of the Oriental. So they said that they're sensual and barbaric and Saracens and blah, blah. And then you pick and choose the characteristics that you think are good and bad. And that's where you get these tropes of the noble savage or the noble slave, right? And this kind of thing, it goes hand in hand. You cannot say that this is a characteristic of a thing that we like without saying that thing has characteristics. Is that clear, or is that not so? Is that muddied a bit more? I'm happy to go more into it if we need to.
Yeah, that is clear. I've just got a question. Isn't that philia also in the West as well, in terms of like white people, you know, them having essential characteristics and, you know, having some sort of fetish of, you know, their beauty and, you know, so isn't that also there as well?
Yeah, it leads me to the next point. Yeah, so that's good. That's so that leads into colorism quite nicely. So if I understood your question correctly, you're saying, do we as colored people also fetishize and have a philia for white people? Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, it can exist. It doesn't exist in the same way, as in we do not have the power to oppress our white counterparts. But yeah, we can have philia for white characteristics, and colorism operates on that, right? So remember how I said colorism and Orientalism are kind of like opposites, but are still racializations. This is a really good kind of like point about that, is that we can have fetishization of certain white characteristics. I wouldn't necessarily call it philia, just to kind of maintain that boundary between we don't have the ability to create those things necessarily, right? So we don't create them. They are created by white Europeans who have created their characteristics. But we can certainly fetishize them, and we can certainly desire them in two ways. We can desire them for ourselves, so we can say, wow, isn't white Europe so civilized, and I wish I could be more civilized like them. Or we could, you know, physically want to be them, i.e. in terms of lighter skin as per colorism. So yes, colorism relies on that. racialization and desire to be white or white adjacent, if you like.
So
and it also relies
the
on
difference is it comes from them. It's their own narrative.
Yeah, exactly, absolutely right. We can narrativize, so I don't want this idea that we don't have the ability to write narratives. It's also the enforcement of that narrative and the popularization of that narrative, right? So in Urdu we might say Gora or Angrez. That means a certain thing that has been narrativized to be a certain thing. Now you could say that, like, I mean, we did growing up. We were like, white people are stinky, right? White people are, they eat ham and that's stuck for Allah, right? But is that a prevalent discourse or narrative within our society? Absolutely not. You have this kind of narrative, and you have other narratives which are like are more popular, like white people can't jump, right? White people have no rhythm, or whatever it is, right? These are definitely types of narratives or racializations, quote unquote, qua white people. But the power to enforce those, or the power to have that narrative mean something other than a funny, maybe not funny, maybe funny is not the right word, but a kind of like an observation, a humorous, what's the word I'm looking for? Humorful observation, or kind of like discussion on music, whatever it might be, right? So I wouldn't say it's the same kind of thing, but we do have the ability to write these narratives. Some of them may gain some sort of traction, others may not. But definitely there's very little power concerned as far as the way we write our narratives. Like, you can't, I mean, to say that white people have no rhythm, and then to try and enforce that within, like, none of us have the ability to make white people dancing illegal, for instance, right? Or to prevent white types of, white invented dancing, right? As an example. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it did. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah. Actually, sorry, like I tend to ramble a little bit, so tell me if I'm rambling or.
No, I thoroughly enjoy it. It's elaborative, like I said. You really help make sense of it. So.
Yeah, good. That's good. I'm glad. It's difficult online as well, because you can't read the room. You can't see people's faces and reactions. So teaching online is definitely tricky. Okay, so yeah, also relies on colorism also relies on self-racialization, and I'm aware that we're rapidly running out of time. So I'll try and cover this as quick as I can. It's shorter than the Oriental bit anyway, so we'll try and cover this as quick as we can. I don't mind going slightly over, but I'm aware that other people may have lives that
it's okay because it'll be recorded anyway. So
okay.
Or you can even go into the next session, or don't worry about rushing. It's fine. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we'll try and hit the main notes anyway. So colorism relies on racializations of white people. So this kind of like positives that we talked about, i.e. white people are civilized, they're the epitome of beauty, they're et cetera, et cetera. I also relies on self-racialization, i.e. we are XYZ. So internalized self-racism operates on that. How does that look? So, I mean, you guys are familiar with this. I don't need to elaborate on this, I don't think, very much. If I do, let me know. But obviously, this internalized and self-racism is lighter skin is successful, clean, attractive. Darker skin is unsuccessful, unclean, unattractive, so on and so forth. So, colorism is interesting. It's an interesting form of racism, interesting form of racialization, because colorism, unlike kind of racism proper, is very much tied to skin and dark skin tropes, right? So it operates kind of like, you can have two versions of this almost, right? So you can say, you can lighten your skin and become more successful and become more civilized and become more blah, blah, right? I.e., you can actually physically and psychologically change your race, because remember, race, quote unquote, is an essentialized, category, which according to racism proper, you cannot change. You cannot change that, no matter how close you become to whiteness or how distant you are from whiteness. Like, you can, there may be a scale. You can be less of that race you are, or more of that race you are. Whereas colorism is like, you can actually become more successful based on the lightness of your skin, right? Of course, even with colorism, you will never become fully white, but it's like you can shed those within your own internal logic. So let's take South Asia or India as an example. Within that internal logic and that internal society, you can say that we can lose those tropes and become like the more successful people within that society. And it is, of course, a physical representation of becoming white, becoming whiter, becoming closer in proximity to whiteness. So it's, I don't think I need to say anything more than that, really, do I? I mean, yeah, you're using Fair and Lovely whitening creams to become physically whiter, or to represent yourself as becoming physically whiter. So its origins are a bit tricky to actually find and discover. Like, it's with colorism, what you notice is that it is prevalent across so many different cultures that are otherwise not linked. So it's prevalent in East Asia, Japan, Korea, Thailand, etc., etc. It's prevalent in South Asia, in India and Pakistan, definitely. It's even quite prevalent in Africa. In Nigeria, it's like, up until very recently, and I think probably even now, it's massively, like, it's a huge deal to do this. So, and even actually in some indigenous communities, there are examples of what we might call colorism today. So that's problematic for us, because how do you then differentiate between racialization and culture, right? So it's not necessarily true that because a culture uses white makeup, that it's internalized racism, right? So, for example, here in the 8th century, way before, Japan was very close for a long time, way before kind of colonialism and the white man became as a dominant as he is in terms of colonialism and etc. Japanese women were using white powder to as makeup, right? Now, it's probably not the case. When I say probably, I mean almost definitely not the case that this was a racialization, or that they were self-racializing. It was probably more the fact that it was the only type of makeup around that could be used to cover up illnesses, blemishes, etc., etc. I'm extrapolating slightly from European practices. So Europeans, like, you see these paintings of like these European noblemen and women who are wearing these white makeup and like a bit of red on the cheeks. I mean, Queen Elizabeth I is a famous example. All her portraits are almost exclusively white. I can think of maybe one portrait of hers that she's not wearing that white makeup, and that was, there was a big practice of covering up syphilis. So syphilis, before antibiotics, used to literally rot the flesh of the face. It used to rot the nose. So they would have these scars from being syphilitic, right? So they used to use this white kind of makeup to cover it up. And even in Japan at the time, in 8th century Japan, there was a saying about white makeup covering up blemishes. So it's probably likely that it wasn't anything to do with racism. It was probably likely that, you're covering up blemishes on the skin, and you're going to use white for whatever reason. So it's tricky to kind of think about the origins and where we then kind of try and define the boundaries of when colorism becomes a practice that's used out of just makeup and a practice that is actually racist. So as I said there, it was something that was associated with higher castes, purely for the reason lighter skin outside of the realms of makeup. Lighter skin was associated with higher castes across a number of societies. I'm speaking mainly about South Asia here, but it was like, the higher castes had lighter skin just because they didn't spend all day out in the sun, right? So lower castes would either be working or laboring in the sun, farming, etc., and therefore they would get tanned and become darker. So lighter skin was associated with wealth and with the rich, and in some to hit that there. So in some even pre-colonial African societies, there's some evidence that there was desire for lighter skinned women because of, a number of reasons, predominantly to do with, probably wealth. Societies had always kind of done to practice this, and some societies, not always, not all societies, but some societies had preferred lighter skin. When does it become racialization? When does colorism rely on racialization and racism? Excuse me. So now we're kind of coming into the colonial period, where these practices are, so you have to remember with the Orientals and stuff that it wasn't kind of like, here's a new system of things, here's a new system of governance, here's a new hierarchy. Orientalism itself relied on pre-existing hierarchies and relied on not necessarily hierarchies, but pre-existing castes and differences in society. And colonialism effectively highlighted them and magnified those differences, right? So where those differences may not be like so important, they may be desirable, but they may not be like differentiating essential factor. So light skin or white makeup may be like, oh, that's a sign of wealth. That's a sign of kind of, you're a prosperous person. Like in the example of the Japanese women, it was almost exclusively noble women that used that practice. So it was a way of differentiating class. It's only when you have interactions with a system of racism via colonialism, via Orientalism, via other kind of like logics of racism, that you then become that you then kind of say, okay, well, if that's the case, let's magnify these differences and create a new logic or a new kind of strata, or whatever it is, based on this European definitions. So the example of the British Raj in India, they created a hierarchy of races in India, right? So I know last week we discussed the 4 categories, right? Within those 4 categories, there also exist subcategories. So in India, for instance, the case is that they basically said the Sikh Punjabis were like a martial race, i.e. they're like strong, suitable for to be in the army, and the Bengalis, on the other hand, are an effeminate race, and these racializations endure today within our South Asian societies and communities, where we're like the Bengalis are all like rice-eating midgets, right? For example, and Punjabis were like tough and strong, and the Afghans are tough and strong, and so on and so forth. this was the hierarchy of races that the British created in India, and then they differentiated on religion as well. But that's a separate discussion. And as a part of that, obviously, like you have the idea of these visual shorthands and these kind of like cultural behavioral shorthands as well. So lighter skinned races or like quote unquote races would be treated with more respect than the darker skinned races. So you would have this system whereby lighter skinned races may work as not officers but high ranking spies, soldiers. They would work as administrators within in civil service, and so on and so forth. And then you would have on the opposite hand the darker skinned or the less desirable races working within a less desirable field of work. So you magnify those differences through that. Then you have this European idea of race, and you magnify it further by spitting out these ideas, these races, these groups, and assigning them particular roles, which still prevail today. I mean, like you still have casteism, like it's a massive problem in India, huge problem in India. It's a problem in Pakistan too, to a lesser degree than India, but I mean, still a very troubling, very, very troubling degree. I mean, when I was there, like in my village, you have anybody who's been to Pakistan would tell you this, that in the villages even you have this. Forget like urban society, but in villages you have this physical difference. Not physical, sorry. I'm talking about physical separation as well. Is what I'm trying to say. Physical separation of these castes. So what we term the Marasi class, which is like gypsy, and they're often a lot darker than your other people in that village, would be physically separated from other people. They would live in their own little kind of row of houses or their own little kind of like bit of land or whatever it might be, and they are almost exclusively given the jobs of maid, farmhand, that kind of thing. The really like kind of like undesirable jobs. So it's still kind of very prevalent to today. So yeah, so the point is that that's when colorism really starts, right? So I make this point because a lot of the times people are like not really, because it doesn't operate on that level of racism or racial discourse. It's just a cultural practice beforehand, and it's only when racism is imported as an idea into these communities, into these countries, where it becomes a racialization, a logic of an extension of racism. Oh, what happened there? I had a picture there, I thought. Okay, colorism today. Yeah, so just some quick examples, and then we'll end. Is there any other questions first before we finish on that? Okay, so colorism today as it exists today. So this is if you have followed Bollywood or if you follow Bollywood, this is Johnny Lever. And I just make a quick point that you should be boycotting Bollywood currently because it's effectively become a mouthpiece for Hindutva. It's kind of like soft Hindutva. So you should boycott Bollywood, but I'm using these as an illustrative example. So this is Johnny Lever. He is considered to be a dark person in India. He's a very successful actor, but he is almost, in fact not almost, he's exclusively playing comedic roles. He's the foil, he's the idiot. He's always in those type of roles, the comedic kind of like relief, and that's because he's dark. No other reason for it than, he's a dark guy, and therefore, He's always playing those roles. There's a bit more about that actually on the Bollywood thing. Before I move on, you know, you have a lot of skin lightening creams in India rely on Indian actors and actresses to promote them. So Shah Rukh Khan famously promoted it. Deepika Padukone promoted it, and that's an interesting case because she's South Indian, and South Indians tend to be very dark. And the only South Indians you will see depicted positively in Bollywood, which is concentrated in kind of what's the Maratha, not the Maratha, we're talking about Maharashtra kind of like area, which is more central India, and is exclusively representative of Central Indians, pretty much. The only South Indians you'll see depicted positively in Bollywood are South Indians with light skin. So Deepika Padukone, like she's very light skinned. She's like one of the only South Indian actresses that's made it really big in Bollywood and has some positive roles. So yeah, that's Bollywood and its interaction with colorism. You have also the colorism as well. So a lot of people, I don't know if you guys ever saw this ad. This is a Nivea ad for some products like moisturize or whatever have you, right? And the caption says, "Revitalize yourself." Now, a lot of people when it came out, when this ad came out, were very, rightly said it was racism. In my opinion, it's more accurate. It is racism, but it's more accurately colorism, right? So the reason I say that is because the gentleman here, the man here, is clearly a black man. And this mask he's shedding are what we may identify as typical, natural hair, really, of black men. The afro hair, kind of curly beard, and so on and so forth, right? Now, there is a narrative around that is uncivilized, or it's unprofessional, it's bad, and blah blah, right? All that kind of nonsense. Now, that is, of course, is racism, but to have it juxtaposed against a different type of blackness is more accurately colorism, because it's not juxtaposed against whiteness. It's juxtaposed against a different type of blackness, which is in distance, or supposedly more closer in proximity to whiteness, right? So the shorter hair, shaved beard, blah blah, right? I mean, those aren't exclusively white characteristics, but in terms of this narrative of professionalism, non-professional, civilized, uncivilized, it's closer to whiteness than it is to blackness. So it's racism. I think it's also a form of colorism. And the reason I highlight this is because we tend to think that the colorism only exists within colored communities. So we racialize ourselves, we racialize ourselves to colorism in our own communities. But it's a narrative that is driven from racism, right? And the wider kind of narrative around this sort of thing is, there are numerous statistics that will tell you lighter-skinned black people, light-skinned colored people will get better opportunities within the workplace, professionally, and in society. And the example that's very often used is Beyonce and Solange Knowles. Beyonce is supposedly lighter, and Solange is darker, and one has a huge amount of success, and one is still pretty successful but not as successful. So colorism is it definitely exists in our communities and has to be rooted out, but it is driven from this narrative of racism from the West. Cool. Okay, I'm glad we managed to get through all of that. Any other questions or comments?
I've got to go, but I've had a question. Something about what you spoke about earlier. It's about Islam.
Islam being a peaceful religion, signifying high morality. Is there any books on that, or any particular author that's written on that?
I believe Said has written on that in his book Orientalism. I do think he mentions it. Yeah, there's definitely some stuff. I can if you drop me an email, there's my email. I'll drop you some reading, some books and some articles if you like.
Okay, awesome. Thank you very much.
No worries.
All right, assalamu alaikum. Thank you for the class.
Yeah, no worries. Any other questions before we end?
No, thank you. Generally appreciated taking the time out.
So, Nadeem, just oh, sorry. Yeah, go on, brother Wahaj.
I was just going to ask for some recommended reading just around the concept of philia.
Yeah, okay. I'll drop you a message, Wahaj, if that's okay.
Okay, thank you.
Is that okay? So if I don't, just remind me.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, if I don't, just remind me. But there's some interesting stuff on that.
Would 1001 Nights be considered philia?
Yeah, to an extent. I mean, yeah, definitely. It's definitely portraying this fetishized idea of Oriental society. You know, it's the thing is, it's never like these things aren't as neat as we'd like it to be. So there's philia and there's barbarity, because there's philia of some characters, and then some characters act in a barbaric manner. So some characters, like the main kind of frame of the story is that this king, and I can't remember his name, you know, he gets married and for one night, and then he kills his wife the next night, right? So that's not something that we want to emulate, or the West wants to emulate, right? But you know, Shahrazadi, for example, the main female protagonist in the frame of the story, is obviously very clever, you know, intelligent and sexualized, right? And that's something that we may want to desire. So it's a bit of both. But yeah, definitely. I mean, I think in terms of mass consumption, there is definitely like this idea that we want, as Western observers, we want to observe and we want to, you know, fantasize about this kind of mythical Eastern lands.
Yeah. Cool.
Any other questions?
And just for color, with regards to colorism, how could you give like a one sort of paragraph or sentence definition of colorism? Because I'm just trying to crystallize what
colorism. Yeah. So colorism is the idea that darker skinned is less desirable than whiter skin. That's kind of like the top note, like high level definition of it.
Yeah.
But that's kind of like, yeah. So it's favoring or desiring lighter skin.
Cool.
Effectively, yeah. Or lighter characteristics. Let's put it that way. Yeah.
So would you say like not just skin, but like white behaviors or behaviors associated with
absolutely, yeah.
Whiteness? Okay. Cool.
Well, yeah, the logic of colorism basically follows that if you have lighter skin, you become lighter in characteristic also.
Okay, right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Because it's like the lighter you become, it's part of it's a conceit. Part of it's concealing your color. Part of it's actually trying to adopt Western ideals and Western, you know, definitions of success even, right? Yeah.
Cool.
Okay. Is there any other questions?
Inshallah.
We'll see you next week.
All right. No worries. Inshallah. We'll end it here. Inshallah. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. جزاكم الله خير, everyone.
بارك الله.